I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I was studying foundations. Specifically, the municipal building on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, built in 1893. I was interested in a purely engineering question. Why did a building intended to house the county clerk's office have a foundation nearly 4 meters deep? This wasn't a cathedral, not a fortress, not a bank vault. This was an office where officials registered property deeds and issued business permits. Why would an office need a foundation designed to support the weight of a cathedral? I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the first-floor windows. Only they weren't on the first floor. They were below street level. The tops of the frames barely reached my ankles. Windows that had once let in daylight now looked down into the ground. Not basements. They were designed to be a full-fledged work floor. Some might say, cultural layer, a natural rise, in the ground level. Perhaps. But 5 feet over 130 years isn't a natural accumulation. It's an event. Something came and covered what was here before us. Or someone raised the street, and no one asked why. I started digging through the building's municipal archives. Not historical surveys, not local history collections, but a catalog of primary documents, construction reports, acceptance certificates, inspection reports. Most of it was routine, unreadable, tedious prose. But in a section labeled Unclassified Municipal Employee Statements, I found a name that changed the course of everything I'd been working on. Edith Thorn, Cuyahoga County Health Officer. Her reports weren't classified, weren't seized, weren't challenged. They were simply unindexed. They lay in a catalog that, judging by the condition of the spines, hadn't been opened in the last 100 years. Not hidden, forgotten. And I'm beginning to think that the difference between these two words means a lot more than we're comfortable admitting. To understand what exactly I found in her records, you first need to understand who Edith Thorn was. Not as a person. Almost nothing about her survives outside of official records, but as a job title, because the job title explains everything else. In the 1890s, America was undergoing what the bureaucrats of the time called record standardization. It sounds innocent. In practice, it meant that states were, for the first time, attempting to systematically record who was born, who died, and where the bodies of those who died before records began. Cities were growing. Old cemeteries were getting in the way of development. Land that had been used for burials for a century was suddenly needed for railroad depots, commercial districts, and municipal buildings. Someone had to be present when these graves were opened. Someone had to record exactly what was being removed from the earth, in what condition, in what proportions. This was the job of municipal health inspectors. Edith Thorn was one of them, and according to Cuyahoga County personnel records, one of the few women in such a position west of the Appalachians. Her job was neither romantic nor mysterious. A form, a pencil, a presence on the site. She went where a backhoe or excavator dug up the earth and uncovered bones. She measured, she recorded. She made classification marks in the appropriate boxes. Gender, approximate age, state of preservation, reason for exhumation, estimated height in life. Then she submitted the completed form to the county health office. No interpretation, no analysis, just data. That's why her records are so important. Thorn didn't hypothesize. She had no theory, no agenda, no reason to record anything other than what she saw and measured. She was a measuring instrument in human form, and that instrument was calibrated by bureaucratic protocol, not curiosity. When such a person records an anomaly, it should be taken more seriously than any newspaper sensation, because a sensation is born from the intention to surprise, and a form is born from the obligation to record. The first report that caught my attention was dated March 4, 1893. The location was a construction site at the intersection of Euclid Avenue and East 9th Street. A foundation was being laid for a new commercial building. While excavating, Workers discovered remains at a depth of about 8.5 meters. An inspector was called. Thorn arrived. I held a copy of her form in my hands and read it as she filled it out. Left to right, column by column. Gender, male. Estimated age at death, middle-aged, 30 to 50. Condition, fair, skeleton nearly complete. And then the column that was, in fact, the reason I was in this archive in the first place. Estimated height in life, 7 feet 4 inches, 223 centimeters. She didn't put an exclamation point. She didn't add a comment in the margin. She didn't write unusual or anomalous next to the number. She filled out the next section, femur length, and checked the box that, within the confines of this form, was the only way to say, out of range. A small square in the lower right-hand corner of the form labeled non-standard proportions. A check mark. That was it. I stared at that check mark for a long time, because I understood what it meant in the context of the bureaucratic protocol of the 1890s. It meant there was a separate box for such finds. Someone, when writing this form, had anticipated the possibility that an inspector would find remains that didn't fit the standard anatomical tables, not as an exception, as a category. The box doesn't appear on the form if the phenomenon occurs once in a century. The box appears when the phenomenon occurs frequently enough that recording it has become routine. Thorn checked the box and moved on to the next section. For her, it was Tuesday. For me, this was the point after which I could no longer return to what I considered a normal understanding of the 19th century. I spent 4 days at the Cuyahoga County Archives. During that time, I went through every surviving report Edith Thorn had written for her tenure, from 1,891 to 1,904. About 400 forms. Routine. Endless, monotonous, lulling routine. Remains of streetcar track widening. Remains of sewer trench digging. Remains of a demolished warehouse. Cleveland was growing, and the earth that held the dead of the last century gave way to the foundations of a new one. Thorn recorded it with the methodical precision of a clock, form after form, line after line. And in 7 of those 400 forms, a check mark in that very box, irregular proportions, 7 times in 8 years of work, 1,893, Euclid Avenue, the first one I started with, 1,895, clearing an old burial site in Newburgh Heights. 2 reports from 1,897, both at construction sites, one for the Post Office Foundation, the other for the Cuyahoga Riverfront expansion. 1,899, sewer work on Kinsman Road. 1,900, exhumation for the redevelopment of the city cemetery. And the last, 1,901, again a construction site, this time for the county courthouse. The heights listed in these 7 reports vary from 6 feet 11 inches to 8 feet 2 inches. Femurs, each with a note about their length not matching standard tables. Not once, not in any of the 7, does Thorn add a personal comment. No surprise, no guess, no attempt to explain. Just numbers and a check mark. I sat in the reading room and counted. 7 out of 400 is 1.75%. Seems like a pittance. But then I thought about something else. Thorn, 1 inspector, 1 county, 8 years. And in Ohio, in 1,890, there were 88 counties, each with its own inspector, its own forms, its own construction sites. If Thorn's ratio was even approximately consistent across the state, and I had no reason to believe Cuyahoga was an exception, then we're not talking about a single anomaly. We're talking about hundreds of records, scattered across dozens of archives, which no one has ever compiled into a single spreadsheet. Not because it's forbidden, but because no one has thought to ask. When I returned from the archives, I did what I should have done from the start. I started cross-referencing. I took the dates from Thorn's reports and dug into Cleveland newspaper archives for the same years. I didn't have to search far. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, June 1895. Giant bones recovered from ancient burial in Newburgh Heights. Same location, same month. The same skeleton, which Thorn described as adult male, estimated height in life 7 feet 11 inches, unusual proportions. The newspaper wrote, giant. Thorn wrote a number. I found 3 more matches. The Ohio State Journal, 1897. Giant remains on Cuyahoga River bank. Workers shocked by skull size. Thorn, for the same period, had form number 214, column after column, without a single shock. The Cleveland Leader for 1900. City Cemetery Mystery. Giant skeleton discovered among ordinary graves. Thorn. A check mark, a femur, a length in inches, a discrepancy note. The same fact. 2 completely different languages. And here's the important thing. It was precisely this difference that determined the fate of the information. Newspapers gave it a voice, but a sensational, shrill, easily vulnerable voice. By the 1920s, these publications could already be written off as yellow journalism, a hunt for circulation, an era when editors printed anything to sell copies, and they were written off. Academics had learned to treat newspaper reports of giant skeletons as folklore, not worth verifying, not worth citing. But Thorn's forms are not folklore. This is the bureaucracy. Dry figures in official columns, filled out by a man paid not for astonishment, but for accuracy. And here begins what I call double oblivion. Newspapers were discredited, actively, through ridicule and condescension. Forms were forgotten, passively, through lack of indexing and indifference. 2 methods applied to the same fact yielded the same result. The fact ceased to exist, not because it was refuted, but because both languages in which it was recorded proved, each in its own way, unsuitable for being heard. I was interested in a simple question. What happened to the remains after Thorn filled out the form? Not in a general theoretical sense, but concretely, through a paper trail. Where exactly did the bones she measured and classified as non-standard proportions go? Cuyahoga County protocol on this matter was unambiguous. Remains discovered during construction or excavation work were turned over to the county medical examiner's office. From there, depending on the classification, they were either returned for reburial or sent on to higher authorities for further study. The designation non-standard proportions automatically downgraded the find to the latter category. This meant a request to the Smithsonian. I found confirmation in 2 of the 7 reports. Thorn had neatly written the transfer document numbers in the accompanying column, the very numbers that would allow one to trace a particular skeleton from the Cleveland soil to the Washington repository. I wrote down these numbers and began searching. The Smithsonian's catalogs are partially digitized. Not completely, far from completely, but the basic structure of the collections is available to researchers. I searched by number. Nothing. I searched by acquisition date. Nothing. I searched by county, by state, by find type. And then I discovered something that stopped me for hours. The classification category under which such finds were registered in the Smithsonian's collections, a category documented in the 1890s as skeletal remains of unusual morphology, North American region, has been abolished. Not by scandal, not by investigation. As part of a planned collections restructuring carried out in the 1920s. I want you to understand what this means in practice. When a library abolishes a catalog section, the books aren't burned. They're moved to other sections, sorted into related categories, or, if no related category fits, placed in unclassified storage. Unclassified means unsearchable. The object physically exists. It sits on a shelf, lies in a drawer, takes up space. But it's not in the accounting system. It's not lost. It's not destroyed. It's nowhere. This isn't a conspiracy. I want to be precise in my formulations. This isn't a conspiracy, not a covert operation to conceal evidence. It's something more subtle and perhaps more effective. Administrative declassification. When it's not the object that disappears, but the category to which it belonged. When not the answer, but the question itself is abolished. And here's what haunts me. The restructuring of the 20s affected precisely that category. Precisely in the decade when newspaper reports of such finds ceased throughout the country. Coincidence is possible, but coincidences are becoming numerous. I want to step away from Edith Thorn for a moment. Not because her accounts are exhausted, we'll come back to them, but because there's a parallel body of evidence I can't ignore. It's not directly connected to Thorn, but it coincides with her timeline so precisely that the coincidence itself becomes a fact requiring explanation. I'm talking about photographs. Beginning in the 1860s, studios across America, Europe, and the Russian Empire began producing photographs showing people of normal height standing next to people whose heights couldn't be explained by standard biological variability. The carte de visite of the 1960s, the cabinet cards of the 1970s and 1980s, the tintypes of the 1990s, formal studio portraits, not fairground booths, not circus posters, people in everyday clothes, in everyday poses, sometimes surrounded by their families, and their height, judging by their proportions relative to the objects and people in the frame, is between 230 and 270 centimeters. A modern person's first instinct is fake, photomontage, collage. But here's the problem. The photographic techniques of the 1860s and 1870s made high-quality forgery practically impossible. A wet collodion process, long exposures, a uniform grain across the entire surface of the plate. If you try to combine two images, the border is visible. The shadows don't match. The grain breaks at the junction. Later, by the end of the century, manipulation became technically possible, but detectable. And these photographs have been tested, not by everyone, not systematically, but by individual researchers, and the result has always been the same. The grain is uniform, the shadows are consistent, there are no signs of editing, and that's what haunts me. This photographic corpus is concentrated in the same 30-year window as Thorn's findings, roughly from 1,860 to 1,900, and then it disappears. Not gradually, not as technology became obsolete. People didn't stop being photographed. Studios didn't close. It's just that a certain type of person stopped appearing in the frame. It's as if the people themselves had vanished, or as if someone had decided they were no longer worth capturing. Now I want to go back to where I started, to the building on Euclid Avenue, to the window below the sidewalk, because when I first stood before it, I saw an architectural oddity. Now, after Thorn's reports, after the photographs, after the vanished catalog categories, I see something different. I see a scale that perhaps has an intended recipient. I walked inside. The building has long been remodeled, of course. The interior partitions have been moved. The ceilings are suspended. The lighting is modern, but the load-bearing walls remain. And the doorways in those load-bearing walls are original. A second-floor work corridor, not a front entrance, not a reception area. A corridor used by clerks to move from office to office. The doorway is 10 feet 60 inches high. I stood in that doorway, and above my head, there was space large enough for another person my height, up to my shoulders. This is not grandiose. Grandeur makes sense in a lobby, a courtroom, a space meant to impress. The hallway between offices is a utilitarian zone. No one is meant to impress here. People pass through here. The staircase, the same building, the same original stonework. The step height is 26 centimeters. The standard for modern construction is 15 to 18. I climbed it and felt each step require an effort, light but noticeable, as if the stairs were designed for a stride longer than mine. And then I remembered the figure from Thorn's first report. 7 feet 4 inches, 223 centimeters. A person that tall has a stride length roughly 30% longer than mine. I took out a tape measure and measured the depth of the tread. It was exactly a third longer than the modern standard. I'm not claiming causation. I'm not saying this building was built for people over 6 feet tall. I'm saying that the skeleton dug out of the ground 300 meters from this building, in the same year it was built, matches its proportions perfectly. And when I started checking other Cleveland municipal buildings from the same period, I found the same scale, the same hallways, the same steps. It's as if they were all built to the same standard, a standard that makes no sense to people our size. After Cleveland, I thought I was dealing with a local anomaly, the peculiarity of one county, one period of development, one set of designers who, for some reason, built slightly larger than necessary. I would have been comfortable stopping there. A local anomaly is an explicable thing. It can be attributed to regional tradition, to the ambitions of a particular architect, to the specific soil that forced the construction of more massive structures. But I didn't stop there. And what I discovered next robbed me of that comfort. I started simple. I requested construction specifications for municipal buildings in other Ohio cities for the same period. Columbus, Cincinnati, Toledo, the same doorways, the same staircases, the same inexplicable excess of scale in utilitarian areas. Not in every building, but in enough numbers that the word coincidence began to sound far-fetched. Then I expanded the radius. Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, administrative buildings from the 1870s and 1890s, government buildings, post offices, courthouses, office corridors with ceilings too high to reach, stairs designed for a stride I don't have, office furniture in museum storage, chairs with a seat height of 75 centimeters, listed under decorative arts or atypical Victorian design, as if 19th century people en masse ordered furniture they couldn't sit on, simply for aesthetics. And then I crossed the ocean, and it took my breath away. St. Petersburg, administrative buildings along Nevsky Prospect and the embankments, built in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I found measurements taken by restorers in the 2000s. The doorways in the service corridors of the Senate are 3.5 meters. The staircases of the 12 collegia, each step 25 centimeters high. The tread depth a third greater than any modern standard. Not grand staircases, not throne rooms. Service passages used by officials to move between offices. Buenos Aires, municipal buildings on Avenida de Mayo, 1880s to 1890s. Same scale, same proportions. Delhi, colonial administrative buildings, supposedly built for British officials of an average height of about 170 centimeters. The furniture inside, tables and chairs that would make these officials look like children in a principal's office. Melbourne, Cape Town, Lisbon. I stopped counting cities. I started counting continents. 4 continents, different empires, different construction schools, different materials, different climates, different cultures, and one architectural code. The same redundancy in the same types of spaces. Not in churches, where monumentality serves religious sentiment. Not in palaces, where scale serves power. In offices, in corridors. In places where the sole function of architecture is to ensure the passage of the human body from point A to point B. And everywhere, this passage is designed for a body we don't have. They'll tell me it's fashion, an architectural fashion for neoclassical grandeur, spread throughout the world through magazines, model projects, and academic education. I'm willing to debate this explanation, but I have one question it doesn't answer. Fashion is when you make beautiful things at the expense of practicality. Fashion ends with the facade. The front entrance, the reception hall. Fashion doesn't penetrate the service corridor, where no visitor enters. No architect in their right mind would design a 3-meter-high doorway in a room that no one but clerks would ever see, unless those clerks were 2.5 meters tall. There's a date around which everything revolves. Not a specific day, not a specific event, more like a threshold, a line drawn across history, after which a certain type of information simply ceases to exist. This line runs through roughly 1,920. I didn't notice it right away. It emerged gradually, as I began piecing together the data on a single timeline. Newspaper reports of large skeletal finds, the New York Times, the San Diego Union, the Middletown Signal, dozens of regional publications across the country, begin in 1,860, gain density in the 1980s, and peak in the 1990s. These aren't isolated curiosities. It's a steady stream of information, year after year, from state to state, from newspaper to newspaper. The same reports of bones that don't fit into anatomical charts. And then, around 1,915 or 1,920, the stream stops. It doesn't dry up. It cuts off, as if someone turned off a faucet. The photographs are the same. Studio portraits of people of abnormal height are concentrated between 1,860 and 1,900. After 1,900, isolated shots. After 1,920, practically nothing. Photo studios continued to operate. Cameras became more accessible. More people were photographed than ever before in history. But these people were no longer among them. And here is the third line on my scale, the one that made me put down my pencil and sit silently for a few minutes. The restructuring of the Smithsonian Institution's collections. The abolition of the classification category. Skeletal remains of atypical morphology. 1,920, the same decade. 3 independent streams of data, journalistic, photographic, institutional. 3 different environments, 3 different mechanisms of recording, 3 different communities of people, completely unrelated, and all 3 fall silent in the same time window. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in a room where 12 people in identical suits decide to erase a piece of history. Reality is more complex and, frankly, more frightening. Because coordinated silence doesn't necessarily require a coordinator. A shift in what is considered an acceptable question is enough. When academia decides that a certain topic is unscientific, newspapers stop writing about it, not because they're ordered to, but because the editor doesn't want to appear frivolous. When a museum system decides that a certain category of artifacts is unclassifiable, researchers stop looking for them. Not because they're forbidden, but because looking for something that isn't cataloged means looking for something that officially doesn't exist. When photographers stop photographing a certain type of people, perhaps because those people no longer exist, or perhaps because photographing them has become inappropriate, inexplicable, or uncomfortable. I don't need a conspiracy to explain this synchronicity. I need just one generation deciding, consciously or not, that certain questions are no longer worth asking. One generation is enough. The next one no longer knows the question existed, and the third one won't believe you if you say it was once obvious. I'm not going to jump to conclusions. Not because I don't have any, but because conclusions are a way to close a conversation. I want to open it. So instead of answers, I'll leave you with questions. The ones I've been asking myself over the months of working with this material. The ones I've tried to ask people whose professional opinions should matter. And the ones I've never received anything but polite silence in response. Why have municipal reports on skeletal remains of unusual proportions, compiled by staff inspectors as part of official protocol, never been the subject of systematic academic study? not isolated newspaper articles that can easily be dismissed as sensationalism. Official documents, forms, signed, dated, numbered. Why hasn't a single anthropological journal in the last 100 years published a review that even raised the question of the statistical significance of this data? Why haven't photographs of people of abnormal height, taken in an era when technology ruled out high-quality falsification, been subjected to modern digital analysis? We have tools that didn't exist 20 years ago. Spectral grain analysis, software reconstruction of lighting conditions, modeling proportions based on the known dimensions of objects in the frame. Why aren't these tools used? Not because they're expensive. A student lab could handle it in a semester. Why are the architectural proportions of administrative buildings of a certain period explained by a fashion for grandeur, when this grandeur is found in utility corridors, utility rooms, service staircases, spaces that fashion, by definition, doesn't enter? Why is this explanation accepted without verification, without measurements, without a basic comparison of the opening dimensions with the anthropometric data of the intended users? And here's the question that troubles me more than any other. Why, when you put all these facts side by side, forms, photographs, architecture, the simultaneous disappearance of data, the reaction of the professional community is not, "Let's check," but "It's irrelevant"? I know how the academic environment works. I understand the pressure of grant committees, the reputational risks, the hierarchy of acceptable topics. I don't blame specific people, but I want to call what I see by its proper name. This isn't censorship. This isn't a conspiracy. This is a structure in which certain issues aren't banned. They're simply not rewarded. And in a system where careers depend on publication and publications depend on approval, the difference between banned and discouraged ceases to exist. I think of Edith Thorn often, not as a source of data, though she certainly is that. I think of her as a person, a woman in a job almost no one wanted. Construction sites, rain-washed excavations, the smell of earth and what the earth held, a form in a leather folder, a pencil sharpened with a penknife, and the need to be precise because the county demanded precision, because protocol demanded precision, because the number in the box was all that was expected of her. She didn't know she was doing something important. It needs to be said out loud, because that's the whole point. Edith Thorn had no idea that more than 100 years from now, someone would open the folder of her forms and be unable to forget them. She didn't leave a message for posterity. She closed her workday. She checked the box labeled non-standard proportions, handed the form into the county office, and went home. And the form went in the mailbox. The drawer slid into the closet. The closet was locked with a key that was eventually lost. And everything she recorded, 7 times over 8 years, 7 quiet, unremarkable checkmarks, became part of the silence. Not destroyed information, not classified, simply unheard. I closed the archive. I went outside. Cleveland passed me, busy with its own affairs, like any city. And I looked at the buildings, not as I had before, not as a backdrop, not as the familiar fabric of the city, but as a question we enter every morning and exit every evening, never once asking for whom it was posed. Here is this doorway you pass through on the way to work. Have you ever wondered why there is so much emptiness above your head? Here are these stairs you climb a little more diligently than you should. There's this chair in the museum's storeroom, labeled decorative Victorian, that you couldn't sit in without dangling your legs like a child. We've gotten used to it. That's what I've learned over these months. We've gotten used to it, and in our habit, we've lost the question. The most perfect form of oblivion isn't burning a library. It's when the library stands there, the doors open, the catalog accessible, but no one comes. Not because it's forbidden, because there's no point, because no one remembers there was anything there worth coming for. Edith Thorn filled out 400 forms. In 7 of them, She wrote down what she saw, without interpretation, without emotion, without the intention of surprising anyone. Simply, numbers that didn't fit into the table. And these numbers lay for over a century in an unindexed catalog, waiting not even for a researcher, but simply for someone who might think to look. I looked, and I can no longer see these buildings the same. I can't climb these stairs without counting the height of the steps. I can't pass through these openings without feeling the space above my head, the space that someone once needed. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there's an explanation for all this that I haven't found. One that would make every coincidence seem random, every check mark a mistake, every doorway an architect's whim. Perhaps. But as I stand on the sidewalk and look down at the window that was once on the first floor, no one has offered me that explanation.